Hey everyone, this is the sig-auth meeting for February 1st, 2023. We got a few items on the agenda, so I guess we can get started. Let's see, I don't see any announcements. All right, so we can get to discussions. So the first item, let's see, Jordan, I know I discussed this with you in passing. I wanted to ask folks here just to make sure we were sort of on the right path. So Nalek was looking into implementing wildcard support for the encryption configuration, which today just takes a string that represents a group resource and parses it into group and resource and just does pure string matching. But as you can imagine, it wouldn't be necessarily hard to put some wildcards in there. So like initially I had wanted to support stuff like you can encrypt every resource within a group, just because that sounded kind of nice. And also wanted to support like encrypt a bunch of stuff, but not some other stuff that's like overlapping. The way the encryption config is structured, it's really painful and hard to try to like come up with a strategy that results in a thing that the user would understand that they did right, basically. Like because you can specify providers at multiple levels and you can provide resources at multiple levels, and you could have overlaps sort of arbitrarily, right? Like if you supported group wildcards, you could be like talking about like the core group or some other group, and then you could have star.star meaning everything. As a starting point, at least, we were going to just maybe try starting with, if you do star star, you just can't specify anything else. So you basically get encrypt all or nothing kind of deal. And maybe we could figure out a way to make it less meh, like reduce the strictness of the validation over time.
So the config file, the matching goes in order, right? Like the config file says, here's what I want to encrypt. And when it's looking up how to encrypt a particular resource, it starts at the top and goes through item by item until it finds an item whose resources list match that type of resource. It says, I have found the config for this resource. And then it looks at the providers for that entry and says, that's what I'm going to use. Is that how it works?
Not that simple because
No.
yeah, it because it needs to know like what provider is going to be used for encryption versus all the providers that may be used for decryption.
Okay. From a user perspective, if I can look at the file and a particular resource and start at the top and say the first entry that matches this resource, like this blob will control how it will be encrypted. As a user experience, that seems, I can explain that, I can document that.
Yeah.
Like today, we don't support star star. But if we added support for star star, and so you could say things like, I want to do a particular thing with secrets, and then the next thing I want to have star star match some other configuration. Like I can explain that to someone and say, like, you start at the top and the first entry that matches your resource is what we use for the config. Does that seem like a
Yes,
possible to implement?
Yeah, like Nilek and I should have done a better job of writing down some examples of configs that as we went through this exercise, and we're like, yeah, let's just write out a bunch of configs and see what we think they should do. It wasn't super obvious what was going to happen.
I'm happy with the goal of letting someone say, I want to encrypt everything.
Yeah.
I think if it starts at the top and goes down and the first match controls what gets used, that's probably the most reasonable outcome. I don't know what that looks like implementation wise. What do other people think?
Yeah,
I think
Go ahead, David. Go.
I was gonna say, I think it's worth noting that going in order does allow essentially the negative matching that you expressed, because you can choose your selective thing first. It would be consistent with selecting a group. And one of the reasons why we don't support it in the REST APIs that we normally have, like RBAC doesn't do this, is because they don't have the same sort of consistent ordering. I think I can only think of a few examples where we said we're going to order by name and go in order. And that might even have just been OpenShift APIs. So going in order seems like a good option to me to get the thing that you want without having to build out a full, here's how you express priority when you have multiple matches.
Okay. So if someone put in their first configuration star.star, and then the second one secrets, the second one is just ignored.
Yes, because nothing would hit it.
Right. Okay. Oh man, we have to rewrite the whole parser. It just doesn't do this right. It makes the assumption today that it can do purely string-based structure building, and now you have strings that mean more than one thing, basically. So it has to be smarter than what it is today. Okay. Yeah. So if it's just purely looking down and we have to, yeah, I think we can make it work if we just rewrote the parser to do it in that way. Like basically right now, I think it tries to flatten the list all the way down, and I think it just needs to not do that to make that work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Someone putting star star and then later putting secrets, that seems like something we could probably like catch and maybe disallow, because it seems like an error. So if we can catch or warn or disallow later things that are totally masked by earlier things, that would be nice to do if we're in there being nice.
So what if you did like, I always forget which order it is. It's resource.group. So if you did star.foo group, but then you also did like bar.foo group, that's also an error because the star is going to match.
I would let you be as nice as you want it to be.
Yep.
I don't, what do you mean, David? Just to make sure.
I would not make
as
it a
many
requirement, but if you wrote it, I would say, sure, let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right, cool. All right. So Nilek, now we have a lot of extra work to go do to rewrite that parser.
Yep. Yeah, I think the flatten out thing we'll have to figure. I mean, we do have order in the beginning, but then we just say that nope, we are just throw away that order and here is the map, and we're just gonna pick the transformer from there. But I guess we'll have to think about that approach then.
Yeah, I think I think we have to not let it get all the way flat. Basically, I think we have to keep some of the structure around. All right, fine. Okay. All right. Well, that tells me what I need to know for that. Anyone else have any comments on this before we have a probably very long conversation with Rob? All right, cool. So has everyone had a chance to read this that cares about this topic? I know Jordan, you read it a bunch because you made a bunch of comments. David, did you have a chance to look at it?
Not in detail. I think this came up before. Wouldn't mind say a 2-minute summary, particularly around permissions. Yeah.
Rob, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So reference grant, the entire idea, this came from Gateway API. We've discussed it 2 times previously at sig-auth, so it should be familiar, at least at a high level. We had 2 specific things we were trying to enable. One of them was cross namespace references to TLS certificates, so that a gateway or a load balancer could have a TLS certificate attached in another namespace. And then the other one was cross namespace forwarding. So the idea that a load balancer could forward traffic to a backend, a service in another namespace. In both cases, we wanted to enable a cross namespace reference and have a handshake on the other side. So the reference grant sits on the other side, on the receiving side, and says, I trust references from this other kind of resource in this other namespace to reference me. And this was well defined, at least we thought it was well defined within Gateway API. And when we initially brought this to sig-auth, the idea was, let's start in Gateway API. It meets your use case. It's reasonably sensible. And if others have a similar need, we can discuss more at that point. More recently, Sig Storage started using the same resource. And that kind of has forced the issue of, we should probably try and find a more natural, neutral home for all of this. And that has brought up more broader questions about, how do you take this resource that had two very clear purposes to begin with, and known use cases, and make it something that is sufficiently generic that it could work for future unknown use cases. That's where we're at now. You specifically asked about access control, I think, or authorization. One of the things that Jordan mentioned in the CAP that's currently unresolved is it would be very helpful to have some kind of requirement that the person creating the reference grant resource that's allowing the access, allowing the reference to occur, actually has either read or write access to the resource they're allowing to be referenced. That, because reference grant today is only a CRD, that's not done, but that does seem at least theoretically plausible as part of this. I can answer any follow-up questions, but hopefully that's a good intro.
Yeah, and then from my memory, as I recall discussing this a while back, might have been a year ago, this didn't do anything on its own. So
Correct.
This was a way to express intent, but didn't actually grant read permissions, for instance. That would be something that would have been built on top. If you have a reference grant and I have accepted it, then maybe another controller grants read access to a thing.
Yeah, correct. That's a very important detail. Thank you. This whole process assumes that it is being implemented by something that has broader access. So the most common thing is, Gateway API, I think we have around 19 different controllers right now, 19 different implementations. And all of them would implement reference grant. This is runtime verification. So the idea is that not only does it grant, but also if the grant has been removed, revocation needs to happen. And before I forget, I should also mention Shane is also on this call. He's also a Gateway API maintainer, and he can jump in if he has anything to add or at any point.
Thanks. I think that's like my background. I think I'm caught back up. But
Thanks.
So I have a lot of open questions. One that I forgot to write down, which probably is the most critical one, is, so Rob, so I know Gateway API is using this, and something in storage land is also using this. In general, are we comfortable with the idea of like codifying cross namespace interactions? I mean, it sounds like we are, because we already have two places that are doing it. So it's it's not like you can go back and undo it.
Yeah. No, I think it's provided significant value in my opinion, but it is certainly a stretch to say we have provided this for now 3 very clear, well-defined use cases we're providing a generic means to do this for potentially anything in the future. I understand that is a stretch that we need to be cautious with.
The thing that I've been sort of stewing on, there are 2 aspects. Like if this is wildly successful, and we're like, oh, cross namespace sharing is cool. There are two aspects of this approach that I'm trying to think if we'll be happy with. One is that if a common reference grant object starts getting used by lots of different people for lots of different APIs, in order for the controllers who are going to honor it to use it, they have to have basically global visibility to all reference grant objects. Is that like when it was just for Gateway API, if this was just the Gateway API reference grant, then it makes total sense that the Gateway controller can see all instances of this object. Will we be happy with all controllers of maybe varying permission levels having global visibility to all cross namespace granted information? So if I want to give access to a TLS secret to the Gateway API, my homegrown controller that's like doing some custom resource cross namespace grant is going to know about my TLS secret's name and existence and namespace and consuming namespaces. That's one question. The second question is what you described earlier, Rob, about like we're counting on controllers to basically already have access to the objects and self-limit consumption of them or access to them. For things that are scoped to a particular type, like the gateway controller having access to all gateway resources, again, makes total sense. If I'm going to share a TLS secret from one namespace to another namespace, I wouldn't really want the gateway controller having global secret read access to all secrets that exist. And so are we encouraging people to basically give global read access to objects and then say, but no, it's cool. We had a reference grant. They're going to limit themselves, right? So those are the two questions. Like by making it a general thing, I'm just anticipating controllers that install with like get all secrets and get all reference grants. And they're like, but it's cool because we're using this library to limit ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. And we've definitely seen cases where ingress controllers and certainly in the future gateway controllers have, they sit on the front, right? And so if they sit on the front and also happen to have access to all secrets in the cluster, it's a scary thing. A lot of our inspiration for reference grant came from Contour. And what Contour did is they really tried to encourage deployments to keep all their TLS certs in one specific namespace. Reference grant enables that. It is just one of many patterns you could use, but it is a pattern that I think is better than default, but not well documented. But I think reference grant can be used in a good way. I know talking with Mo, I think earlier Mo had suggested something like we could have a custom authorizer, which may be what you're getting at as well, Jordan. I don't know how that would work. It may be amazing, but that's outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think the difficulty is the user creating the reference grant saying it's fine for gateway objects to use this secret. They don't even know the identity of the controller that needs to have read access to the secret. Like that information isn't available to that user.
Yeah.
Like ideally, those two things could have happened at the same time. Like the user could say, it's okay for this secret to be used by gateways in this namespace. And also, here's read access to this secret to the controller who needs to actuate that. But they don't have that information, and controller identities aren't really an API that we've, like at that point, the controller username becomes an API, which is kind of crazy. So I don't have a particular solution in mind. I'm just trying to stew on like, what are we going to motivate people to do?
So Rob, on the, I don't know what the term is, like deployment topology of like having a namespace that's, I don't know, my awesome TLS certs namespace, where you put all your TLS certs and then you give read access to your gateway controller to all secrets in just that namespace. That sounds like at least something we should mention somewhere in the KEP as like at least a answer to the question of, well, even if you give access to read, even though you need to give access to read a bunch of stuff, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be cluster wide. You can constrain it with like careful deployment. I mean, to Jordan's point, it would be really cool if you made a reference grant that somehow allowed the actor to also read the thing just by the reference grant existing. That'd be real cool. But as Jordan said, we don't know the identity to give the read access to, or whatever the access is. It might not be read, it might be right. David, I saw you unmuted. If you want to.
I did. I was gonna ask how much better that is than just saying, if you have permission to read this thing, you can create a role and a role binding that says, other person, you can now read this thing. But I guess I'm more interested first in knowing, how does a user, when they create a reference grant, know which controller, if any, is going to honor the reference grant that they have created? Like, as a user, if I have this generic API, it's not obvious to me that I can use it generically. And if I use it wrong, I don't know what feedback I get.
Yeah, that's entirely fair. In Gateway API, the only feedback at this point that we have provided is on the referring objects. So, for example, a gateway referring to a TLS certificate, there would be an error present on the gateway in status if the reference was not allowed. There in the KEP itself, there is a question of if we should have some kind of status or feedback mechanism on reference grant itself. The concern of that, so Gateway API left space for status, but did not implement status. And I know that status may on its own not be a good solution to this, but it is thus far the only thing that we've considered, open to alternatives.
Even if we used status, what would fill in a status of, I'm not doing a thing with this thing?
So one of the proposals I mentioned, not directly in the KEP, but in a conversation, actually, I think it's in the KEP now, would be that status could be used as a kind of controller name and a pair of controller name string plus approximate number of resources this resource is granted access to. So this reference grant is currently providing access to this many references, or for this, I'm not exactly sure what that would be, but an approximate order of magnitude of this controller is both watching this and also relying on it for X number of things.
And so it would be the absence of information in status that would indicate.
Yeah, I mean, that's anytime you have a resource like this, at least this is what we found in Gateway API, that is implemented by multiple controllers. Absence of status is really all you can rely on, because you can't, there's nothing that publishes the lack of implementation, right? There's no component that exists that can say, hey, like, I'm not implementing you. What we've relied on in Gateway API is we have some defaults that show that nothing is currently implementing this, and then a controller can pick it up and overwrite that. But other than defaults, that's about all we can rely on.
So then I'll throw out like the counter example, right? If this is a specific resource, if it is a Gateway API reference grant, then it's very clear who owns it, what a user could expect as a result. And in a way that the generic one does not. Is that actually a value add of having a specific type versus a generic type?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think related to that is a conversation somewhere in the CAP unresolved right now of if we want verbs in reference grant. So one of the concerns about reference grant today is we've kept it very tight and we've kept it defined to Gateway API use cases and now this one sig storage one. But if you create a reference grant and you attach two arbitrary things, how do you know what kind of reference you're enabling? You know, in reference grant, in Gateway API, we haven't had that issue yet, but if it becomes arbitrary, then you can imagine it would. Verbs help, you know, you can imagine a forward traffic verb, that bad name, but something like that, or a read cert, or yeah, I don't know. So various verbs like that very clearly capture the intent. And then I think that is very close to what you're describing, David, of a gateway specific, you know, that this grant is intended specifically for gateway use cases. I don't know if that, go ahead.
I'll say, if Mo will indulge me one more, I guess my next thought is, it sounds like you have created a powerful serialization, right? The idea of a reference grant serialization that says that this is how I can map like tos and froms and maybe a usage combined with them is useful in terms of being consistent. But do you actually need to apply the same serialization in two spots, right? In the two examples you have, is it actually better to have one for Gateway API? Here is where I store my reference grant kind. And in the storage one, I use the same kind, the same serialization, and store it into a different resource so that when I list them, I can say, I have the controllers, it solves the controller problem where you look and say, do I want to have permission to read all of these? It solves a user problem of maybe people who are allowed to assign this grant to storage aren't allowed to assign the same grant for the Gateway API. And it resolves the user expectation problem of what do I expect to happen when I use this? Because it's different. I expect different things to happen depending on what the consuming controller is, right?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good idea I hadn't thought of. My biggest concern is the kubectl UX around that is awful. You know, you basically just have to use fully qualified names in every command or chaos. But, you know, I think that feels solvable, maybe. I don't know. That definitely does solve the controller access or help with controller access. It is unfortunate that you would, I don't know how you maintain that spiraling mess if, you know, more and more SIGs come on board and I'll want to basically do the same thing, but in their own API group. And then we get tiny little variations of the Gateway API one adds a verb and the other one doesn't. And, you know, it solves a real problem or set of problems and adds other ones is what it feels like.
So on the same topic, so one of the things I had asked about, which was basically, should reference grants be targeted at a single controller with a field that can be selected on, right? Now, when I use the word controller there very loosely, it was really meant to, like, the controller would be like gateway, like, or Gateway API, right? Like, I know it's many controllers and many implementations, but they're conceptually the gateway controllers or Gateway API controllers. So that's like a thing. So it doesn't solve the read access problem because it's still one resource. But it would solve the, who am I giving, like, who do I expect to address this reference grant, right? If I have Gateway API listed, the CSI controller, whatever it does, will just ignore it because it's not meant for it, right? It doesn't matter. Like, so the name that you're codifying is an API, but it would just be a single string that doesn't really have to change. right? So it's not like it's an identity, but like a sort of a fluid one that represents.
I mean, it seems like you already have, like, is it important to distinguish the particular controller? You're already saying, here's the type that's going to be consuming it. It seems like any controller servicing that type should have access. Like we're already describing what this is for in the
So
from.
does an autoscaler manage the deployment resource? And if
No.
it manages a deployment resource, does a deployment controller also manage a deployment resource?
Deployment controller does, an autoscaler does not, because it accesses deployment's scale.
I mean, clever, but it's not obvious to me that we have a clear one-to-one mapping.
No, I think it's fine to not have a one-to-one mapping, actually. A one-to-one mapping means that like if two of the controllers involved in an object needed to, you have one setting something up and one tearing something down, but they're both authorized to take action related to an object. I don't know. I don't think we necessarily want a one-to-one mapping. If I don't want to derail us too much, but I'll just ask this. Like if we could make the user experience be anything we want, would expressing the intent for my local thing to be used by some remote thing, would we want that to both grant access and sort of make the record of the cross namespace grant? Or do we like having reference grant be sort of inert and require a second authorization, like real authorization step, however that's done, for the controller or whatever's actuating this to actually have cross access?
In the TLS case, I like it if the reference grant is the one that grants you the access, because like the controller, the access to read the TLS secret.
Mhm.
Because right now, I think most controllers are given broad access, or the deployment has been carefully tuned to only look at one namespace for TLS secrets, basically.
I like that as well. My concern is, would reference grant be misused then, just to create, basically grant read access? I mean, I guess you're just considering reference grant at that point at the same level of admin access as any other RBAC resource.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if it was actually effective at granting access and didn't just record intent, then yeah, it would have to be treated like, you have to have the permission you're trying to grant. I'm mostly trying to not move forward with half of a story that has this like unspoken and also really grant access, and we don't have a good way to do that, and so everyone's just going to give global read access.
That's fair. It does concern me that as much as that sounds ideal, it sounds a long ways out. It sounds.
How are people using reference grant? How are they granting controllers access to read? What have you seen?
I honestly, I think most is the global access that we're used to today, for which is not great. So.
Okay. We can move on to some of the other questions, like the selection stuff.
Well, actually, I have another one related to this. So I'm not as familiar with the Gateway API. If I've understood this properly, my expectation is that I have this way to expose some sort of ingress into my cluster. I need to use a serving certificate. To do that, I go to a gateway ingress of some kind. I specify a secret namespace and name, and then in order to explain to prove to the controllers behind the scenes that I have permission to read this, I also get a reference grant that I create in another namespace, and there is an opt-in in the original namespace. Is that how this works today?
Correct. The reference grant lives alongside the secret in this case that's being referred to. So it has to live in the same namespace. And ideally, as Jordan's describing, should connote the same level of access, right? So that the person creating the reference grant in the secret namespace should also have read access to that secret. That last part is not enforced today, but is part of this cap.
So if there's already another object that says, I want to use this thing, I want to reference this secret namespace and name, how is this reference grant better than a role binding today, or a role or role binding today, where it's because you have global read access. It's not a case you don't have any access and they grant it to you. It's a case of you can read anything and you need to limit yourself. I see. Okay, I've made the last hurdle. Yeah, I am also
welcome, David.
Yeah. I was a little slow arriving. I have finally gotten there. Yeah, that's the opposite of the direction I would have expected that to build up from. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but right, like the gist of the problem is you have lots of stuff running in lots of namespaces that needs TLS certificates, and the controllers are servicing a bunch of different namespaces. So the ideal situation is users put TLS secrets in their own namespace because that's that's normal. And then that gets problematic if you don't want to give global read. Well, then if you put them in some other namespace, well then, like, how does the controller know you're allowed to read that arbitrary secret from that namespace for your?
Yeah, I see. Okay.
I mean, I guess you could imagine, instead of there being a reference grant, there could be some schema for the controller to generate a subject access review based on the specific thing it's trying to validate, right? And if that was allowed, the controller would know you have the reference grant. And if it was not allowed, it would know that you don't have the reference grant, and thus it wouldn't let you do it.
To clarify, are you referring to a subject access review for the user that is creating the gateway, or the author of the gateway, or are you, like, controller wouldn't have that? Are you actually talking about like a bespoke way of a new way of using a new role, a new verb, basically, that would be the how you use the subject access review? I don't know.
So what I was trying to conceptualize is, controller has all this state, and it sees a gateway service thing, and it's saying it wants to consume a secret from over here, and it needs to like hook it up, right, and say, yeah, like, am I allowed, like, is this allowed from across namespace, right? So the reference grant is what is telling it today that is okay. Am I still correct there, Rob? I haven't like gone off the deep end. I was saying that, like, if you could, instead of looking at the reference grant and doing some computation, or looking for a reference grant and doing computation, if you could instead do a subject access review that was somehow built on the thing that you were trying to check, that could theoretically work. I just don't know if you have the information to build a structured subject access review with the right, like, target user. I'm not exactly sure who the target user for that subject check is.
Right. There's like three actors, not three actors. There's the user that created the gateway object. We don't have their identity. That information doesn't exist. All we have is the gateway object. Then there's the information about the gateway object. This is a gateway resource in this API group with this name in this namespace. That's not really the subject. That's like the referring resource. And then you have the controller identity. So those are the actors or the objects in play. Subject access review, like what question would we want the controller to be asking? It seems like the question reference grant is trying to answer is, can this resource reference this other resource?
Yeah,
So it's like
if you
a
could,
resource access review.
yeah, if you could somehow represent gateway as the identity somehow, right? Like this is the identity that is trying to access, and then you had, I don't know, it feels, I don't, it probably doesn't make sense, but it does feel similar to the model at.
This reminds me of like delegated access discussions we've had in the past, where when a controller took an action in order to actuate some resource, like ideally you would want the action to be authorized both for the controller doing the thing, but then also have information about what it was doing it for, and make sure like that combination was okay. In this case, ideally the controller wouldn't even have access to read this secret if not for this reference from the gateway.
Welcome the ghost of Eric Toon. So as I remember that, his suggestion from, gosh, 7 years ago, was to ascribe an owning service account that was checked for permissions at the point of usage, right? That was, I think that was his very initial sketch. Is that closer to what the gateway API here is trying to model? Like presumably the person creating this gateway ingress, sorry, I don't know the name of it, I should learn the name of it, but that person may not have rights to themselves view the serving cert and key pair, but the actual ingress pod itself or ingress owner does. But you would only want to be allowed to use it if the actor who created, no, not the actor who created, the namespace, something in the namespace where the gateway ingress was created had permission to use the secret even if they can't see it. So that way you could revoke it partway through, right? Like so if you get to a point now where you revoke this check, something actually has to delete this reference grant.
So deleting the reference grant is something that controllers are required to respond to by revoking the access. So that generally means it's pretty destructive in gateway API terms. That means basically spinning down the listener that was relying on that certificate. But in general, it relies on blocking access. And the one thing I want to highlight is, and I think you were kind of getting there already, but it's not that the creator of the gateway needs read access that on the secret they're referencing. They just need somebody who owns that secret to say that secret can be referenced from a gateway over here. But that, again, that the person controlling the gateway doesn't need to, or ideally should not, have access to the secret itself. Just know enough that I'm allowed to reference this and the gateway controller can do what it wants with it.
The idea of responding to revocations makes, if we model this as just authorization checks, like that means that there's nothing that the controller can watch to know that the authorization was revoked. So if instead of watching reference grant and self-limiting and then revoking when a reference grant went away, it instead did a subject access review. It's like, I want to set up an ingress, so I'm going to do a subject access review. Can I access this secret, or can this thing access this secret? Yes. Set it up. Like, you can't watch subject access review results to know like the authorizer in the background changed his mind.
Well, if you create the single subject watch with the actual service account in reference, right? You remember the original proposal was limit my power to the power of the service account that's referenced. Then when the rights are revoked, you're unable to reestablish the watch.
That doesn't seem different than a poll. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be just a recheck at every 15 minutes or whatever your watch got dropped. Right?
I think somewhat related to this, Mo had a question somewhere in the agenda about what Go interface, what Go interface the controllers would use. And I agreed with the idea that, this is similar to the idea of a subject access review as the initial interface. But to make this library helpful, you need some kind of centralized cache or something like that can inform controllers that the reference that was previously allowed now needs to be revoked. And that, so although this looks, I think this is really similar to what Jordan was already saying, that although your starting point can look very similar, you need something more in that library interface, whatever.
Yeah, that was part of the reason I asked. It was like, I see vaguely an authorize thing that takes some inputs and tells me something, but since there has to be revocation, there has to be like, I don't know, add event handler or something that looks like an informer thingy that tells you that you need to, like, I don't know, rerun the authorize function. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what it would tell you, but at the very least, it should trigger you somehow to do something. I mean, at the same time, I don't want controller implementations to just be like, I can't figure it out, so I'll just keep checking. I'll just poll authorize every minute for everything just to see what happens. I mean, I guess it's okay because you're probably only smashing your own cache, so it's not a big deal, but like, it's still not exactly the experience I want people to have. Yeah,
there's something to be said in different directions, right? One of the advantages of authorization is it can be external, right? Can create whatever you want to drive that permissions or not.
Right. No, I'm not like advocating for us trying to somehow make watchable subject access reviews or something like that. I'm more just I wanted to make sure that we captured at some level that there's some nuance to whatever library that we're going to create for people to try to use here. Since we only have like 10 minutes left, and I did want to give like Christoph and Standa some time, what are like any high level quick next steps for Rob here, David, Jordan, and what should we do next here?
I haven't read deeply enough to see if there's a section that compares the generic concept of a reference grant to the specific usage of specific APIs, one for gateway, one for storage, one for whatever comes next. If that isn't already there, I think some sort of detailed dive into it. Like I listed a few cons that came up here. I listed a few pros that came up here. I think describing that in alternatives seems useful because they dealt with how we handled the user interaction.
So David, how long till Cell has access to the authorizer so you could have a custom resource do auth checks? That'd be real cool.
The second alpha should come this release. So it should be in alpha this release. I have not looked for an impl PR yet.
But I haven't been keeping up with the KEP. Does that give access to the authorizer? I can't remember.
It does. The second alpha gives access to the authorizer.
Okay, so it becomes tractable to have like, I don't know, a YAML that you can template out that gives you like reference.
It does, although I think for many permission style checks, crunchy on the outside, like something where you just check when it gets created and then never check again, have some limitations that are not awesome.
I mean, RBAC only checks when you create, right? We don't like retroactively remove stuff because you lost the original access too, right?
That's true.
So, I mean, it's something like, I think that would be my biggest concern about like, hey, let's give some completely external thing that people can reuse, is we have a lot of power in our built-in APIs. And I know custom resources slowly are getting further and further along on that track, but I hadn't kept up with the self stuff. So, okay, with the 8 minutes left, Christoph Standa, what is going on?
All right. Also, yeah, this will be much shorter discussion here. I think we have a few updates on the kube proxy. Addressing of the items from the pre-acceptance tasks. As you can see, many of the items on the list are already checked out. In the past few weeks, we basically reworked most of the logic to use the upstream handling of options, and then we use the kube API service secure 7 to actually serve the proxy, and then we use the delegated authentication and authorization. So yeah, much of the code changed. I think it now looks much closer to what the sig-auth wanted us to do with the repository. I think that the heaviest tasks have been addressed. That there are still two left. One is documentation, and the other one is H2C topic that I believe Krzysz wanted to talk about, and I believe that Krzysz also wanted to give an update on some of the tasks that he was working on.
Yeah, so basically, Standard joined forces, and he made quite a lot of nice changes. It looks really like a Kubernetes project now. And removed on the way half of my changes that were more kind of closer to the previous logic. So great thanks to him that he supports me. It jumped forward. And yeah, basically what left for me was basically to check the CVE that David mentioned in the first review, that it doesn't fit. And David had also some suggestions about some security issues that might come. So I verified some of the default settings that we were running with, that everything is safe and okay. And I think that's mostly it. The only question is about H2C, if we want to keep supporting it or not. So basically, it's HTTP2 over TCP. And I think it was necessary for, back then, for Helm, the #1 version. I think Tilla or something like that needed it. And kube proxy was used to protect it. So the question is, do we still want to move forward with it, or do we want to drop it? Because we also created a new branch, which is called sig-auth acceptance, because some of the changes that we need to do to satisfy the review was to make breaking changes. So the question would be, if we're doing already some breaking changes, do we want to make another leap and drop more of the features that we think might not be necessary anymore? Or do you want to try to keep it? Because it's really hard to know until the users start complaining, right? So we are curious what the opinion of sig-auth is, if this is a feature worth carrying on or not. I remember that I had a discussion with David where he said that he would be more or less fine as long as the upstream doesn't trust the proxy. So when we have, for example, the feature that you can add identifiable information into the header so that the upstream can use it. So this would be something that we need to remove in case that the connection is not encrypted.
So just in case, say my memory from looks like that was David 9 months ago, and people here aren't aware, are we talking about the connection where an external user is sending their token to the kube proxy as does not have TLS enabled? Or are we talking about we always require TLS for the user to send us their token, and we optionally allow non-TLS for the connection from the kube proxy to the backing server?
It's to the backing server. So I think with the last pull request that Sander made to the new branch that we created, there was no non-TLS. So the proxy is not serving anymore without TLS.
Okay, so
TLS
that part
now
is
also-
already cleared. Like it's the case now where we don't allow someone to send us a token without TLS enabled. And now we're
Yes.
just talking about whether it is acceptable to have a backend that only speaks HTTP.
Well, it's between the connection between the kube proxy and the backend. If it should always be TLS, or if we allow non-TLS connection with HTTP 2.
Okay.
Because in some cases there are some edge cases where some services rely on that.
I guess I would ask if we're only talking about H2C here on the from RBAC proxy to backend, like H2C like is relatively like advanced as far as like things go. Like who's using this?
Well, so basically, kube proxy is something that Frederick Brunchick did, and I watched his explanation on a meetup on YouTube where he kind of said that it was contributed to protect the Tiller from Helm 1 because it was without TLS, and with kube proxy you could have some kind of protection in front of that. But I didn't follow up on it very strictly because I'm not the Helm user.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand how are people using kube proxy today? Are they if you had TLS coming into kube proxy, are people reusing, like, are they re-encrypting between kube proxy and their backend also? I don't know.
I mean, it's certainly possible, and I guess that it might be done that way.
So you can imagine two cases, right? There's one case where you use kube proxy to establish all the permissions. And if the request comes to your backing process, it is good enough. You don't need to know who the user is. They've already been authenticated and authorized. And in that case, it's pretty clearly safe to use HTTP if you really don't want to have a secure connection and you're local inside the pod. You could argue that that's safe. In the other case, you would say, okay, I do want to know what user it is because I'm going to take action based on which user it is. And then should we support a use case where you don't actually protect yourself from external connections or somebody else saying, hey, yeah, you know what? I am system master for this little pod. Give me rights. Should we make that possible is I think the last question.
Yeah, so traditionally what I've done in this specific sort of topology is to support things like service meshes, which I know isn't the case here because probably not, but what I've done in the past is I have allowed the clear text connection as long as it was either directly 127.0.0.1:1 or a UDS. So if I could 100% guarantee that the thing I was talking to was local to me, then I was okay with a plain text connection. Otherwise, I was like, no, you gotta re-encrypt it and figure it out.
I think that is recognizable.
So, yeah. So I don't think it blocks the normal use case for what people have, which is it's right, like the things are co-located, so there's nothing to intercept. But it also protects people from sending tokens or trusting tokens in contexts that don't make sense. At least it tries to. It's not perfect. I mean, you can't protect them from making like a different listener on their app that is like unprotected or something, but you can certainly encourage them in the right direction here.
Okay, so summarize it as the suggestion is to keep it under certain restrictions.
Yeah, I mean,
it means you have restrictions, right? So you would keep it, you would not send the user or identifying information unless it was directly to a file or to localhost.
Okay, good. That's a rule that sounds implementable.
Yeah. I mean, if somehow you had proof that no one was using it in that way, then I'd be like, yeah, you could drop it. But I don't think that's the case. I fully suspect that people are using it as their front door and not exposing their service in any other way. So it seems like, I don't think it has to be, by the way, H2C. It can just be regular HTTP1 plain text also. I don't think that matters. H2C is like weird because like you need a relatively like advanced network stack to support it. Like I think we take for granted how good Go is at networking. I've recently been learning Rust, and I have learned how bad it can be when your standard library cannot like do TLS. So yeah. So we're like,
Okay, so Mo, you said you would be willing to do the review.
yeah, I know. I will do the. You tell me what you want me to review. You start assigning me stuff, and I'll review it.
Basically, I think it worked really, really well with David last time that we were basically in a meeting. We broke it up in 1 hour meetings, and we basically went through the code base, and then he discussed with me what he sees, what he's happy about, what he's not happy about. I mean, especially not happy about things were the things that really created kind of comments on a pull request. And yeah, I think it's a good way to work on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to schedule some time with me, yeah, let's do that. Yeah, high bandwidth makes it go back faster. So yeah, that sounds better than me spending hours reviewing the entire code base. So yeah, we can do that. But yeah, we are like way over time. So we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Well,
Thanks. Bye.